So I keep on trying to show you this video, so I want to do this before I forget. This is Bjorn Lomborg, who wrote the book The Skeptical Environmentalist. This is the guy that questions everything, the kind of philosophy and science about environmental studies. So essentially questioned just the base statistics. And like all statistics, you can kind of adjust them for whatever needs they are. Bjorn is kind of a hero. A movie came out on him called Cool It. But some of the background from this individual is that he was kicked out of the Danish Academy of Sciences. He published this book. It was at Cambridge University Press. And the reaction was so strong and so enormous globally that the government, the Danish government, felt compelled to remove him from his faculty position and kind of strip him of his credentials entirely. Mostly because he would question these kinds of the greats in science, and in so many different fields of science too. E.O. Wilson being one of them at Harvard, saying that his base facts about issues about biodiversity were incorrect, along with a number of others, some scientists who passed away. Many Nobel Prize winners, he directly contradicted their claims. And I guess people probably wouldn't have noticed so much if his book wasn't published on a very important press, kind of a very specific and respected academic caliber. So Bjorn Lomborg had a very difficult time for many, many years as this kind of pariah. And he slowly but surely tried to make his case. One of the important things, and you'll see it here in yet another kind of little TED presentation, but they've got good subtitles. I don't think it's necessary, but you'll see that he makes an argument about where is the best place to possibly spend our money. Should we bother spending our money on things like climate change, or are there other alternatives that we should probably pay attention to, like education or economies in developing nations, areas where some of the root causes of environmental issues are coming from. Maybe we can focus on those issues first, not treat the symptom, but treat the actual problem. We will achieve what we need to achieve. And the very fact that if we spend a fortune on trying to change climate change, we would only change the temperature of the Earth by a few degrees. And is that worth the billions of dollars that are in the economy? So let's hear a bit of his kind of an argument. I think what's also important is that, there is a bit of a kind of a religious-like litany when it comes to environmental issues. Most scientists absolutely have the same kind of position, and that's a bit scary. There's very few facts in science, let's say string theory, or concepts of, I don't know, anything in chemistry. I'm trying to think of something. There's always someone that's a detractor, or kind of someone that's just an argument. When it comes to the environmental debate, or at least human-induced change of temperature on the globe, there's almost no detractors, and that's scary. That sounds like a religious litany, as if they're repeating themselves and not being skeptical or questioning. Speth, who is the former dean of the Yale School of Forestry, published a book that kind of is a summation of all the papers in peer-reviewed journals that discuss man-induced climate change. There's something like 480-something papers that have been published that have certified or established that climate change has been caused by humans. There are 0 papers published in a peer-reviewed journal of any kind that he could find that would say otherwise. So 0 to almost 500 is pretty big. So that suggests there's a bit of a problem. So Bjorn Lomborg came into this climate and trying to set up an alternate view. He'll also make opinions, and I don't know what's going to be in this TED Talk. I haven't seen his TED Talk, but he'll also make opinions about the loss of polar bears. It's kind of another theme. It is not necessarily because of temperature changes melting the poles and losing their biotope, their kind of territory where they can eat and mate and live is disappearing, is not really causing them to die off as quickly as Inuit hunters shooting them on a yearly basis for food and for other things that they need them for. And these same hunters have been doing it for generations. It's actually part of their lifestyle, being Native Indians to the Arctic climate. And that if we wanted to save polar bears, spending $300 billion to slowly change the temperature of the Earth by a few degrees to keep it cooler for the polar bears is absurd, when we might want to provide food and shelter to the Inuit Indians that are using polar bears to survive. Or maybe, that would be another form of interruption anyway. So he will take statistics that are out there and about climate change, and he will, especially the big ones, and he will skew them in a way that makes for a very different argument. So let's see what he has to say. Go back to it.
Remember to press the blank on the remote, please.
What I'd like to talk about is really the biggest problems in the world. I'm not going to talk about the skeptical environmentalist. Probably that's also a good choice. But I am going to talk about what are the big problems in the world. And I must say, before I go on, I should ask every one of you to try to get out pen and paper, because I'm actually going to ask you to help me to look at how we do that. So get out your pen and paper. Bottom line is, there is a lot of problems out there in the world. I'm just going to list some of them. There are 800 million people starving. There's 1 billion people without clean drinking water. 2 billion people without sanitation. There are several million people dying of HIV/AIDS. The list go on and on. There's billions of people who will be severely affected by climate change, so on. There are many, many problems out there. In an ideal world, we would solve them all. But we don't. We don't actually solve all problems. And if we do not, the question I think we need to ask ourselves, and that's why it's on the economy session, is to say, if we don't do all things, we really have to start asking ourselves, which ones should we solve first? And that's the question I'd like to ask you. If we had, say, $50 billion over the next 4 years to spend to do good in this world, where should we spend it? We identified 10 of the biggest challenges in the world. I'll just briefly read them: climate change, communicable diseases, conflicts, education, financial instability, governance and corruption, malnutrition and hunger, population migration, sanitation, water, and subsidies and trade barriers. We believe that these in many ways encompass the biggest problems in the world. The obvious question would be to ask, what do you think are the biggest things? Where should we start on solving these problems? But that's a wrong problem to ask. That was actually the problem that was asked in Davos in January. But of course, there's a problem in asking people to focus on problems, because we can't solve problems. Probably the biggest problem we have in the world is that we all die, but we don't have the technology to solve that. Right? So the point is not to prioritize problems. The point is to prioritize solutions to problems. And that would be, of course, that gets a little more complicated. To climate change, that would be like Kyoto. To communicable diseases, it might be health clinics or mosquito nets. To conflicts, it would be UN's peacekeeping forces, and so on. The point that I would like to ask you to try to do is just, in 30 seconds, I know this is, in a sense, an impossible task. Write down what you think is probably some of the top priorities. And also, and that's of course where economics gets evil, to put down what are the things we should not do first, what should be at the bottom of the list. Please, just take 30 seconds, perhaps talk to your neighbor and just figure out what should be the top priorities and the bottom priorities of the solutions that we have to the world's biggest issues. The amazing part of this process, and of course, I'd love to, I only have 18 minutes, so I've already given you a substantial amount of my time, right? I'd love to go into and get you to think about this process, and that's actually what we did, and I also strongly encourage you, and I'm sure we'll also have these discussions afterwards, to think about how do we actually prioritize. Of course, you have to ask yourself, why on earth was such a list never done before? And one reason is that prioritization is incredibly uncomfortable. Nobody wants to do this. Of course, every organization would love to be in the top of such a list, but every organization would also hate to be not in the top of the list. And since there are many more not number one spots on the list than there is number ones, it makes perfect sense not to want to do such a list. We've had the UN for almost 60 years, yet we've never actually made a fundamental list of all the big things that we can do in the world and said, which of them should we do first? So it doesn't mean that we are not prioritizing. Any decision is prioritization. So of course, we're still prioritizing, if only implicitly, and that's unlikely to be as good as if we actually did the prioritization and went in and talked about it. So what I'm proposing is really to say that we have, for a very long time, had a situation where we've had a menu of choices. There are many, many things we can do out there, but we've not had the prices nor the sizes. Okay? We have not had an idea. Imagine going into a restaurant and getting this big menu card, but you have no idea what the price is. You know, you have a pizza, you have no idea what the price is. It could be $1, it could be $1,000, it could be a family-sized pizza, it could be a very individual-sized pizza, right? We'd like to know these things, and that is what the Copenhagen Consensus is really trying to do, to try to put prices on these issues. And so basically, this has been the Copenhagen Consensus process. We got 30 of the world's best economists, 3 in each area. So we have 3 of the world's top economists write about climate change. What can we do? What will be the cost and what will be the benefit of that? Likewise, in communicable diseases, 3 of the world's top experts saying, what can we do? What will be the price? What should we do about it? And what will be the outcome? And so on. Then we have some of the world's top economists, 8 of the world's top economists, including 3 Nobel laureates, meet in Copenhagen in May 2004. We called them the Dream Team. The Cambridge University Press decided to call them the real Madrid of economics. That works very well in Europe, but it doesn't really work over here. And what they basically did was come out with a prioritized list. And then you ask, why economists? And of course, I'm very happy you asked that question, because that's a very good question. The point is, of course, if you want to know about malaria, you ask a malaria expert. If you want to know about climate, you ask a climatologist. But if you want to know which of the 2 you should deal with first, you can't ask either of them, because that's not what they do. That is what economists do. They prioritize. They make that, in some ways, disgusting task of saying, which one should we do first and which one should we do afterwards. So this is the list, and this is the one I'd like to share with you. Of course, you can also see it on the website, and we'll also talk about it more, I'm sure, as the days goes on. They basically came up with a list where they said there were bad projects, basically projects where if you invest $1, you get less than $1 back. When there's fair project, good project, and very good project. And of course, it's the very good project we should start doing. I'm going to go from backwards so that we end up with the best projects. These were bad projects. As you might see, the bottom of the list was climate change. Now, this offends a lot of people. And that's probably one of the things where people will say I shouldn't come back either. And I'd like to talk about that because that's really curious. Why is it came up? And I'll actually also try to get back to this, because it's probably one of the things that we'll disagree with on the list that you wrote down. The reason why they came up with saying that Kyoto, or doing something more than Kyoto, is a bad deal, is simply because it's very inefficient. It's not saying that global warming is not happening. It's not saying that it's not a big problem, but it's saying that what we can do about it is very little at a very high cost. What they basically show us, the average of all the macroeconomic models, is that Kyoto, if everyone agreed, would cost about $150 billion a year. That's a substantial amount of money. That's 2 to 3 times the global development aid that we give the third world every year. Yet, it would do very little good. All models show it would postpone warming for about 6 years in 2100. So the guy in Bangladesh who gets flooded in 2100 can wait until 2106, which is a little good, but not very much good. Right? So the idea here really is to say, well, we spent a lot of money doing a little good, and just to give you a sense of reference, the UN actually estimates that for half that amount, for about $75 billion a year, we could solve all major basic problems in the world. We could give clean drinking water, sanitation, basic healthcare, and education to every single human being on the planet. So we have to ask ourselves, do we want to spend twice the amount on doing very little good, or half the amount on doing an amazing amount of good? And that is really why it comes in a bad project. It's not to say that if we had all the money in the world, we wouldn't want to do it, but it's to say when we don't, it's just simply not our first priority. The fair projects, notice I'm not going to comment on all of these, but communicable diseases, scale-up basic health services just made it. Simply because, yes, scale-up basic health services is a great thing. It would do a lot of good, but it's also very, very costly. Again, what it tells us is suddenly we start thinking about both sides of the equation. If you look at the good projects, a lot of sanitation and water projects came in. Again, sanitation and water is incredibly important, but it also costs a lot of infrastructure. So I'd like to show you the top 4 priorities, which should be at least the first ones that we deal with when we talk about how we should deal with the problems in the world. The 4th best problem is malaria, dealing with malaria. The incidence of malaria is about a couple of billion people get affected with malaria every year. It might even cost up towards a percentage point of GDP every year for affected nations. If we invested about $13 billion over the next 4 years, we could bring that incidence down to half, We could avoid about 500,000 people dying, but perhaps more importantly, we could avoid about 1 billion people getting infected every year. We would significantly increase their ability to deal with many of the other problems that they have to deal with, and of course, in the long run, also to deal with global warming. The third best one was free trade. Basically, models showed that if we could get free trade, and especially cut subsidies in the US and Europe, we could basically enliven the global economy to an astounding number, about $2,400 billion a year, half of which would accrue to the third world. Again, the point is to say that we can actually pull 200 to 300 million people out of poverty very radically fast, about 2 to 5 years. That would be the third best thing we could do. The second best thing would be to focus on malnutrition, not just as malnutrition in general, but there's a very cheap way of dealing with malnutrition, namely the lack of micronutrients. Basically, about half of the world's population is lacking in iron, zinc, iodine, and vitamin A. If we invest about $12 billion, we could make a severe inroad into that problem. That would be the second best investment that we could do. And the very best project would be to focus on HIV/AIDS. Basically, if we invest $27 billion over the next 8 years, we could avoid 28 new million cases of HIV/AIDS. Again, what this does, and what it focuses on, is saying there are two very different ways that we can deal with HIV/AIDS. One is treatment, the other one is prevention. And again, in an ideal world, we would do both. But in a world where we don't do either, or don't do it very well, we have to at least ask ourselves, where should we invest first? And treatment is much, much more expensive than prevention. So basically what this focuses on is saying we can do a lot more by investing in prevention. Basically, for the amount of money that we spend, we can do X amount of good in treatment and 10 times as much good in prevention. So again, what we focus on is prevention rather than treatment at first rate. What this really does is that it makes us think about our priorities. I'd like to have you look at your priority list and say, did you get it right, or did you get close to what we came up with here? Well, of course, one of the things is climate change again. I find a lot of people find it very, very unlikely that we should do that. We should also do climate change, if no other reason, simply because it's such a big problem. But of course, we don't do all problems. There are many problems out there in the world. And what I want to make assure of is, if we actually focus on problems, that we focus on the right ones, the ones where we can do a lot of good rather than a little good. And I think actually, Thomas Shelley, one of the participants in the Dream Team, he put it very, very well. One of the things that people forget is in 100 years, when we're talking about most of the climate change impacts will be, people will be much, much richer. Even the most pessimistic impact scenarios of the UN estimate that the average person in the developing world in 2100 will be about as rich as we are today. Much more likely, they will be 2 to 4 times richer than we are. Of course, we'll be even richer than that. But the point is to say, when we talk about saving people or helping people in Bangladesh in 2100, we're not talking about a poor Bangladeshi. We're actually talking about a fairly rich Dutch guy. And so the real point, of course, is to say, do we want to spend a lot of money helping a little, 100 years from now, a fairly rich Dutch guy? Or do we want to help real poor people right now in Bangladesh who really need the help and whom we can help very, very cheaply? Or as Sheldon put it, imagine if you were a rich, as you will be, a rich Chinese, or a rich Bolivian, or a rich Congolese in 2100, thinking back in 2005 and saying, how odd that they cared so much about helping me a little bit through climate change, and cared so fairly little about helping my grandfather and my great-grandfather, whom they could have helped so much more, and who needed the help so much more. So I think that really does tell us why it is we need to get our priorities straight, even if it doesn't accord to the typical way we see this problem. Of course, that's mainly because climate change has good pictures. We have the day after tomorrow. It looks great, right? It's a good film in the sense that I certainly want to see it, right? But don't expect Emery to cast Brad Pitt in his next movie, digging latrines in Tanzania or something. It just doesn't make for as much of a movie. So in many ways, I think it's Copenhagen consensus and the whole discussion of priorities as a defense for boring problems, to make sure that we realize it's not about making us feel good. It's not about making things that have the most media attention, but it's about making places where we can actually do the most good. The other objections, I think, that are important to say is that I'm somehow, or we're somehow, positing a false choice. That of course we should do all things. In an ideal world, I certainly agree. I think we should do all things, but we don't. In 1970, the developed world decided we were going to spend twice as much as we did right now in 1970 on the developing world. Since then, our aid has halved. So it doesn't look like we're actually in the path of suddenly solving all big problems. Likewise, people are also saying, but what about the Iraq war? You know, we spent $100 billion there. Why don't we spend that on doing good in the world? I'm all for that. If any one of you guys can talk Bush into doing that, that's fine. But the point, of course, is still to say, if you get another $100 billion, we still want to spend that in the best possible way, don't we? So the real issue here is to get ourselves back and think about what are the right priorities. I should just mention briefly, is this really the right list that we got out? You know, when you ask the world's best economists, you inevitably end up asking old white American men. And they're not necessarily, you know, great ways of looking at the entire world. So we actually invited 80 young people from all over the world to come and solve the same problem. The only two requirements were that they were studying at the university and they spoke English. The majority of them were, of course, from developing countries. They had all the same material, but they could go vastly outside their scope of discussion, and they certainly did, to come up with their own list. And the surprising thing was that the list was very similar, with malnutrition and diseases at the top and climate change at the bottom. We've done this many other times. There's been many other seminars and university students and different things. They all come out with very much the same list. And that gives me great hope, really, in saying that I do believe that there is a path ahead to get us to start thinking about priorities and say, what is the important thing in the world? Of course, in an ideal world, again, we'd love to do everything. But if we don't do it, then we can start thinking about where should we start. I see the Copenhagen Consensus as a process. We did it in 2004. We hope to assemble many more people, getting much better information in 2008, 2012, map out the right path for the world. But also to start thinking about political triage. To start thinking about saying, let's do not the things where we can do very little at a very high cost, not the things that we don't know how to do, but let's do the great things where we can do an enormous amount of good at very low cost right now. At the end of the day, you can disagree with the discussion of how we actually prioritize these, but we have to be honest and frank about saying, if there's some things we do, there are other things we don't do. If we worry too much about some things, we end up under-worrying about other things. So I hope this will help us make better priorities and think about how we better work together. Thank you.
Okay, so in some ways I sort of covered that. And what do you guys think about Bjorn? The way he kind of set up those priorities. Is he convincing? He definitely reiterated his point a couple of times.
I'm not entirely sure what he means by wealth. You know, when he's talking about envisioning a future in which everyone who's currently rich is vastly more rich and everyone who's currently poor is rich, I'm not sure what he means by wealth.
Yeah, okay, good point. I know someone wants to jump in. I think that what he's referring to is that a couple hundred years ago, the poorest people on Earth did not have access to education or to running water, or toilets and infrastructure, this kind of thing. They didn't have access to air conditioners. They didn't have televisions or any kind of communication devices or telephones, etc. If you look at the poorest people on Earth today, even those that are incredibly poor, have in some level shelter, electricity, running water, access to food, and access to communication systems. I guess there's kind of a difference. What he's doing is projecting in 100 years from now that there will be sort of a wealthy Dutchman. The richer nations will still be rich and get probably richer than those that do not develop. And these people will have a tremendous amount of access to those technologies and lifestyle, while the super poor will be better off than the super poor today, just by sheer trickling down of the various kind of lifestyle methods and infrastructure, etc. etc. I think that's what his point would be. I mean, you could probably stretch the span out a few hundred years. The richest people a couple of hundred years ago did not have access to energy systems that we have today. Couldn't imagine the lives that just the average person has. They would, you know, whether it's healthcare and advances in medicine, or it's you know, just the enormous shift in how anybody could live. I'm trying to think of the design of homes or things that have changed. Those things simply didn't exist. So over time, they create a kind of a richer and healthier lifestyle. Or I shouldn't say healthier. You have the chance and the option to live more. That's just probably what he's referring to. Although I agree that wasn't stated clearly at all. It's slightly abstract. The Rich Dutchman thing. I guess that just means that
well, I guess
the Netherlands are going to be better off. They're always going to be better off.
Well, they're good at building, you know, retainer walls. And so the idea is they'll be in the same with Dutch, building retainer walls to keep the water out.
Right. So there's flooding. The Dutch will. That's the lowest will avoid that.
I guess I felt like what he didn't address was the finitude of resources. Like, you know, the idea, and I mean, on a number of levels. One, he didn't address, in all of the things he was talking about, he didn't address the problems of the impact of human population. And also, if wealth is a measure of available resources, you know, the idea that in that future, all those people, especially in the developing world, would have access to a standard of living that might be comparable to something like now. The first world only has the standard of living that it has because the developing world is they're using them.
Yeah.
They're using them, and so there's this. It feels like every time that when I hear a dream like that, there's always the problem of like, where are your new, where's the new poor people going to be, basically. Unless it's a design issue, unless it's possible that it's, that in this sort of, I think of things like Buckminster Fuller and the idea that, the world, technology and the world and living can be resource efficient enough that we don't require a third world for a first world.
Excellent. I think we should go over Buckminster Fuller. I wanted to do that before. Steven Pinker, blank slate guy, gave a talk where he said that it's amazing what's happened in humanity today. There's such an incredible change in quality of life and access to wealth, etc. And major shifts in how governments are run and how systems are changing. For instance, one of his biggest points was that slavery is less than 1% of the world's population today, while 100, 200 years ago, it was 30% or something to that effect. That is an amazing shift. So there was a great population increase, many, many more people, but less of those people were slaves. And I think if there was a reaction, one of the people in the audience said, "What? I mean, I guess that's good, but there's still 1% of the world's population that are slaves, and that's today. So who the hell wants to be somebody in that 1%? And that 1% of billions of people is an enormous amount of people that are slaves. Specifically, they were talking about actually some children in the Ivory Coast that farm cacao beans, and make chocolate for first world children to eat. And these children have never had a Cadbury egg or a Snickers bar or a Mars bar or whatever. We've never seen these kinds of processed chocolates, but they're enslaved for most of their lives, farming the basic gene that makes it for all of us. So that's, there's issues about coffee, etc. So many products that are out there. So I guess that's probably what Bjorn Lomborg is referring to. I think he is accounting for the change in population, because if we do have an increase in the population, we're still going to have people with malnutrition, or still people that are undereducated, or still people with malaria. So maybe that was a consistent factor, which is that it's just going to be a percentage. And if we don't, and I don't necessarily buy everything that he's saying, but I guess he's saying if we prioritize the problems and we attack something like malaria, that means in the future we'll have a larger population, but we'll have less people with something that's solvable for really cheap costs now, as opposed to letting it run and having more people with this disease and costing even more in the future to take care of it, while climate change seems to, and he didn't get into the specific benefits of how to spend money dealing with climate change and what kind of I think that would be kind of I think, it's odd that it went to economics again. Go ahead, you want to say that?
Yeah, well, that's what really stood out to me about it, like that he says let the economists be the ones to prioritize early on in the thing, and then at the end he's talking about political triage. So he's really calling on the technocrats to be the ones responsible. So while I like his methodology of prioritization, I'm not sure that he is right to immediately cede responsibility to technocrats. And who are those technocrats?
What's a technocrat?
Yeah, what is it?
A person who has certain education and capacity to work, in a field of knowledge that's in a level of power over others.
But should the economists be the ones? The finance guys, the economists? I don't know.
Well, it shouldn't be Bush. I guess that would be.
There's that whole thing democracy versus finance in a way. Democracy versus economists. Because economists
see things through their limited filter.
they're very self-serving, right?
Yeah. I did like the fact that got kids in to come. Kids are really good at figuring out problems, and they're very natural in some ways, as far as being able to have the courage to say things that others don't say. So I think that it's interesting that the kids are in alignment with the economists. They necessarily have the same tools to prove the point.
Well, I think he split. Well, I mean, that was the impression I got from the talk. Is the kids came up with the same prioritization. But I think that there's the premise that got slipped in was that currency is the appropriate unit of account for measuring how to prioritize these problems, and currency, as in currency generated or currency lost, is I think that's I'm happy with economists thinking about this stuff and coming up with these lists, but I think it might be a mistake to use a made-up unit that has no physical reality as your unit of account. Yeah, money is, it's zeros. You can add a zero. That's what the chairman of the Federal Reserve does. It's fiat currency. It's not a physically derived unit. And economy is a outgrowth of ecosystems. Options for units would be calories, labor hours, something like that. That are actually
or actually in energy.
Yeah, energy. These are physical units that have intrinsic meaning, whereas money doesn't have intrinsic meaning because of our inability to effectively sync the economic system with cycles of nature. We don't account for externalities, so it's hard to actually value and evaluate the best thing.
Okay,
and that's because of rocking around.
Okay, I can see your point. It's a very good point. Energy, the World Bank had a very difficult problem kind of defining what would be the single unit to make big comparisons between problems that were very fragmented and different from one another. The World Bank was trying, in most cases, to use money. It was an individual by the name of Geoffrey West, spelled with G, decided that actually the problems can be measured for similar reasons in the forms of money or currency at all. But that if you wanted to kind of come up with a singular universal unit for all issues and all problems, it's best to use it in the form of energy, was his kind of argument. And that's what the Santa Fe Institute also kind of follows that same mentality. I think that's a better assessment. But what Bjorn Lomborg was doing was kind of dealing with the issues that come across in places like Davos and folks at the World Bank trying to spend money on particular problems, maybe charitable money or tax dollars or these things that actually exist and everyone's always making a case. I don't think any of you, I mean, every one of you must have read some newspaper someplace that said, geez, if we took the money we spent on the Iraq war and put it here, this is what we could have gotten. So I think he was just trying to be very dollars and cents about it. But you're right, the measurements don't necessarily fall in that same way.
And that's the Center for Philanthropy that he's talking to. So I guess the question is it responsible to communicate something that could be sophistry to a bunch of philanthropists who might not know better?
All right. Okay, very good points. Anyone else have I mean, it seems like a lot of you guys got something to say about Bjorn Lomborg.
I think that, as far as sort of simplifying an issue that people sort of tend to make more mysterious than it probably should be, putting it into dollars and cents made sense because it was very simple to follow, and once again, sort of bringing it back to a childlike state, you kind of knew where he was going with it. And it's the same way that you would do with personal finance if you were trying to get out of debt. You look at the things that you're able to knock out. Some of your larger debts and work your way down, or just trying to find a way to make it more manageable. But I think the supporting facts that he had towards the end of it were pretty presumptuous as far as what we've already talked about with presuming that everyone's going to their wealth will be elevated as at that point and as the years progress, because how do we actually know that? And sort of like you said, where's the new poor going to come from? So
yeah, thing about TED Talks is they're only a few minutes, and you get to very complex issues, and you scratch the surface of the surface, and some of the ones that are not as good, you do have these big gaps in information, or what the hell were they talking about? Because there's so much of a culture behind getting to the point that, for instance, Bjorn Lomborg's at, that he just simply forgot what the hell, he just didn't fill in the kind of pre-knowledge. TED's like pot on some level. It's gateway. It's just the initial kind of drug. It's harmless on many levels. It can be interesting. Its function is to open doors to new ideas and more serious drugs, much more serious drugs. So if you find yourself sifting through TED or whatever, YouTube or wherever you're pulling talks from, and you find some that are interesting, the key component is to, okay, let's find out more about Bjorn Lomborg and his his detractors and the concepts that he's talking about. Who are these world economists that he's discussing, and further define the research. I think that this is. I know so much about Bjorn Lomborg that I do kind of like the guy, and I haven't seen that particular TED Talk. I just just found it there. I've seen so much of his other stuff. I thought that it's good for me to kind of pick it up. I think he's explained himself much better in other cases, but I still see holes in a lot of his points. But thank God he's out there, because he's the one person that is desperately fighting, or I shouldn't say fighting, he's creating criticism in environmental studies and doing it at an enormous scale. So here he's trying to use economists to his defense, and he is not an economist, he's a statistician. And if he made this talk, he shifted the talk to statistics, he would have been in a very warm and comfortable place for him, because he has all of those facts and knows how to kind of create the argument more successfully. He was actually borrowing other people's intelligence and other people's kinds of assumptions, and then importing them into his own thesis, which you never would get that out of a particular TED Talk. But that's a little bit of the background. Yeah?
Why do you think he's the only one?
Well, he's not, but he's the biggest one, and the loudest one, and the one that had the most difficult time getting to where he's at. There's another one. Here we go. There's a MIT cloud scientist. I think I need to Google it, but I won't find his exact name. Climate ecologist, but this was a recent cover of the New York Times. Okay, so that's interesting. It's Lawrence Solomon, but they call him the inconvenient scientist. That's pretty terrific. So, this one here, I guess you can kind of get into it. This is one person who's got the entire field against him, because he's saying that actually climate change is not, if it's man-induced with carbon loading in the atmosphere, but the temperature is going to reset itself naturally through our weather system, especially cumulus cloud cover. So that all of this discussion is ridiculous, and that he's set up a number of proofs that he's convinced say that the clouds are going to reverse the greenhouse effect, period. And at best, he's got a lot of people that say, well, it might be possible. So he has many scientists that are saying it is possible. There's no one else that's jumping on board with him, saying that hey, that's absolutely true. And there's many that say he doesn't know what he's talking about. The problem is that all of this, and that's every single one of these arguments we're making, are models. It's just math. It's just models. There's no actual scientist taking real clouds and manipulating another planet that's identical to ours to get the results that we expect. Freeman Dyson, a physicist in Princeton, an enormous thinker, one of the Manhattan Project people, makes this argument all the time. Everyone that works at this kind of scale doesn't have the actual physical evidence. And there's very few cases of physical evidence. In some points you can get to ice core samples. So these kinds of things are physical evidence. Let's see if we can get a good picture of it. Core samples. And images. So this was some amazing stuff. So they're extracting, yay, I just got my Ph.D. This is really hardcore physical evidence of the entire history of temperature and various gases on the planet Earth, at least in that specific geographical zone. So that is something that you can say, hey, these are facts that have been around. We can measure it for thousands, if not 10,000 of years, and we can really trace accurately what the temperatures are, and then we can look directly to the last 100 years and see that there's a shift. But as soon as you go or start making speculations about tomorrow, there's no physical evidence, and that's a model. So you want to base your model off of existing physical evidence, but until we have the data of the future, it's going to be very hard. That's why everyone has the ability to make some level of detraction, or call it some kind of disbelief. So actually, the internet, you would think, the internet's become more popular and more popular every year, and at the same time, the criticisms of things like climate change or various forms of science have actually also become more popular. So there's kind of a disconnect in the ability to criticize just about anything that the internet really, on some level, promotes. How do I articulate that directly? It seems that there are more people than ever that do not believe climate change is happening or is man-induced. And it seems like the more the place that they always get their information is, this place, the internet. It's very easy to create this information. So the physical evidence part really works. There's also physical evidence with ocean beds, ocean floor studies looking at the acidity and changing quality of the oceans. So you can get sectional layers deep in the ocean that also give you a whole new understanding of water and what's happened with the kind of quality of water we use. So those are big things. But predictions of clouds, that's very tough. One would think, though, that if we were going to manipulate or change or deal with climate change on a big scale, it might be reinventing or designing something that alters cloud cover. So that was a kind of a big guess.
I think it's also interesting to hear the James Lovelock thing that came out about a month ago, admitting that he's been an alarmist in the community. So, I don't know, going back.
Yeah, I think he was saying what I was saying is enough discussion of doomsday.
Yeah, and he's, he just won some award last year, like he won some World, I forget which one it was, but he himself, just a month ago, I just looked it up on the phone yesterday, but said that he admitted to being an alarmist. So that's interesting.
Yeah, let me address that directly. In the field of life cycle analysis, kind of the job is to give you a very accurate read, whatever it might be, and then produce an answer that the public is meant to kind of absorb. What you want to do is you want to create a message that's very accurate, that's built on some real engineering or science of some sort, and that you want to be as close as possible as reality, and then convince the rest of the world. So there's a famous case about diapers. I know we talked about diapers as no impact man, but where there was a massive misinformation about actually diapers themselves, that the public was given at an enormous scale, and then they had to take it back just a few years later. And the public really hates that. They hate being alarmed, and they hate being confused, and then they hate being, told something else, which adds to that confusion. So you really want to get it right. I don't know if James is just admitting that he's been saying for some time wasn't probably the best way to put it.
Yeah, I think that's really great. I think it's wonderful people.
Yeah, it is good, but the public's got one kind of read, and that's what's going to stick. So it's going to probably take him a good 10 years to undo anything that he's done, and by then it might not be too late. But maybe let me get into the deeper part of the diapers story. So there was a group outside of Dow Chemical that was studying plastic versus cloth, and telling every mother on the planet Earth mother and father, what's the best thing to buy for your children, what would have the least effect on the environment itself. And the study, after about a year of looking at all the externality costs, actually, and energy required into producing from cradle to grave of cloth diapers versus plastic diapers, they came out with a very clear statement, which was, without a shadow of a doubt, plastic diapers are better for society, better for children, and ultimately this is the best possible answer we've got. Fine. So off it goes, published in peer-reviewed journals. They looked at the equations supposedly, and it was done. A few years later, someone else decided, who was actually teaching a class in life cycle analysis, ran through the equations and found a really curious set of numbers, which was they were drying in an electric dryer cloth diapers. So you take a cloth diaper, and after it's soiled, you wash it with fresh water. You don't do that with plastic diapers. And then you put it in the dryer for 30 minutes or so, 40 minutes, and then you use it again. Well, true, that does happen. Many people do that. But what if you just simply hung it out to dry? Just put your cloth dryer out in the air. Your cloth diaper out in the air. Well, suddenly you're now using an enormous, you're saving an enormous amount of energy. A ton of energy is saved. And to the point where it switches over the statement. And now plastic is actually worse than cloth diapers, as long as you don't dry them.
Right.
So what happens is that, you try and communicate that to the public, and it just drives everyone crazy. They don't understand. There's a loss of translation. They get confused. Plastic diaper companies get very upset because they've been promoting it all one way in all their packaging and stuff. So, in some sense, no one's perfect. I guess it's probably something to remember. And answers are, they're going to be complicated. But
but I just think I think it's a really healthy way to keep the dialogue flowing, and I think it's great when scientists can admit where they have kind of gone, you know, in a different direction, or maybe sort of change their viewpoints, because it keeps everyone flexible and informed. I don't think there's any
I guess so.
judgment. It's just
Well, you know, margarine is the alternate to butter. It's supposed to be better for you.
right.
Yeah, my father had been, you know, using margarine, I guess, since the 70s, when it was supposedly better than butter. And there are some issues of a certain kind of fat that's associated with margarine that is actually worse for you and affects your cholesterol. And next thing you know, you realize the product that you've been using for the last 10 years is worse than you could ever imagine. You should have been using butter the entire time. Another kind of, there's a million of these, not a million, but there are dozens of them every year, that reversal of prior studies. So, you know, what it does is it makes people unconvinced that maybe science knows what it's talking about. Or
Have you ever heard of the amazing Randy?
no.
He's a myth debunker. He's kind of a character. He used to go on Johnny Carson all the time. So he was kind of big in the 70s, and I saw him once in New York with a friend of mine, and he's a little out there. Yeah, that's it. Exposes charlatans and helps with he's pretty far. He's really far out, but he has a good point. You know, it definitely changed the way I saw the world when I saw him speak and heard him speak.
Amazing Randy, interesting.
The amazing Randy.
He was a stage magician and kind of decided to work in the tradition of Gehry Partners, who had really spent a lot of his life working against people that were abusing the spiritualist movement. And so
I'm glad you know who he is.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Excellent. I love the way it looks. And what's that next to him? A possum or a...
It was a lemur.
A bear?
It just blends into his beard. Okay. All right. Cool. Well, let me. Still good points. And I think what Bjorn Lomborg, and I guess this is my point, is that he's trying to mess it up and kind of confuse the message that's out there. So in this case, though, he's going direct to the throat of science and trying to get them to be much more exact and more convincing and do more work so that it is right.
One thing I'm hearing what you're saying is, or I'm hearing two different messages from you. In one case, you know, questions create this ferment and open discussion, especially with you know, a consensus that could be dogma, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, when it gets out to Homer Simpson,
It can't be.
try not to change it a lot, because then it'll make them doubt, or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay.
And Homer Simpson deserves to get the right answer.
Okay.
Period. Almost like 2 + 2 is 4. And then you know, the science or the intellects behind it, they need to fight more about is really 2 + 2 equaling 4, and to make sure that they've got it absolutely right. So you need someone to check your math. So Bjorn Lomborg's checking the math and saying we're not sure that, and I think we are mostly sure. But God, you know, you don't want to send out a message you have to change later. It's really not always embarrassing, but it's difficult to undo.
Does Homer Simpson watch TED Talks?
I don't know. I think technically no. It's not some kind of, you know, his favorite thing is watching
Itchy and Scratchy.
Yeah, Itchy and Scratchy. But he wouldn't do